He's not exactly a world leader on gender equality, but that didn't stop the kingdom from being elected to lead an important UN Commission on Women's Rights. The monarchy will start a 4-year term next year, heading an organisation which is dedicated to promoting the empowerment of women around the world. Well, my next guest says, quote, electing Saudi Arabia to protect women's rights is like making an arsonist into the town fire chief. Hillel Neuer from UN Watch, welcome to the programme. Can you explain perhaps why you think the UN has made this decision?
Sadly, the United Nations too often fails to live up to the noble principles of its charter. We have politics, and in this case, petrodollars that supersede principles.
In what way petrodollars? Explain a bit more about how that is involved.
Saudi Arabia wields enormous influence at the United Nations, not because of its moral strength, but because it has one of the largest reserves of oil in the world, and it has billions of dollars of sovereign wealth funds, and it uses its wealth to influence countries, to make trades. And the reason that the world's worst violator of women's rights in the world has been chosen by the United Nations to sit on its Women's Rights Commission, a commission that is supposed to empower women and to promote gender equality, is strictly because Saudi Arabia has oil and it has billions of dollars, and countries make trades, secret trades behind closed doors in order to vote such dictatorships onto human rights bodies. It's a black day for women's rights.
But there were 45 countries who voted for Saudi Arabia, and were they all having this kind of?
Well, it's impossible to know exactly why countries voted the way they did. Some of it, of course, may be inertia. The regional group to which Saudi Arabia belongs submitted what's called a closed slate. There were an equal number of candidates for the positions available. And so some countries are lazy and think that they have to assent to whatever has been cooked up behind closed doors. Of course, that's false. And the fact that the United States called a vote, which is rare actually in these elections, usually the arrangements are cooked up and then it's rubber stamped by acclamation. And China and Uganda protested. They wanted to proceed without a vote. The US forced a vote. There was a secret ballot, and 47 out of 54 countries did vote for Saudi Arabia. These include, we don't know which countries voted for Saudi Arabia, but we know that those voting in the election included France, Germany, the UK, Ireland, Sweden, Norway. And the question is, how did they vote? Sweden won't say how they voted. Australia won't say how they voted. The least that we could expect is to have world leaders condemn this. And I do hope that women's rights activists, which are condemning this, will continue to speak out. And world leaders should condemn this absurd and immoral election, which sends the message that the United Nations doesn't really care about women's rights, and it's a betrayal of women's rights activists in Saudi Arabia and indeed worldwide.
Well, could this perhaps be seen as an attempt to encourage Saudi Arabia to bolster women's rights at home, to give it some kind of motivation to do so?
No, absolutely not. That was not the reason why it was done. There are some who work inside the UN who are embarrassed by this decision and seek to justify it with that argument. The fact is that Saudi Arabia has been a member of bodies such as the UN Human Rights Council for a decade. It has not improved their record at all. Regimes seek membership on world human rights bodies for 3 reasons. Number one, to sit around the table when decisions are made, so you can be sure that Saudi Arabia will not be spotlighted by this UN Women's Rights Commission. Second, it's to give themselves a false badge of international legitimacy, just as the Saudi ambassador in Canada 2 years ago, when he about his human rights record, he said, well, we're sitting on the UN Human Rights Council, so the world thinks we have a very good human rights record. And third, finally, it's because human rights activists sitting in prison, like Raif Badawi, a blogger who's sitting in Saudi prison for the crime of calling for democracy, it's to demoralize them. Or Manal al-Sharif, the woman who was arrested for driving a car. Imagine how she feels when she sees the headline that her oppressor, Saudi Arabia, has just been chosen by the United Nations to have a position of influence on women's rights. It's a kick in the stomach. Those are the reasons and the only reasons why Saudi Arabia has pursued this absurd, paradoxical membership.
Hillel Neuer from UN Watch in Israel. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, as the war in Yemen rages on, efforts are underway to raise money for